Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about chaining. So we've talked a little bit about how to increase behaviors, how to decrease frequency of behaviors, how to introduce novel behaviors. But now we're going to talk a little bit about how to modify or introduce more complicated behaviors, specifically behaviors in which you can describe them using multiple different kind of micro behaviors. These are known as behavioral chains. You could think about, for instance, a golf swing, or maybe the broad term of like installing a program. Well, yes, you could consider that one behavior, but really what's happening is multiple different behaviors combining in a specific order in order for this kind of large macro behavior to occur. So if you think about a golf swing, there are a lot of different muscle movements occurring that you need to pay attention to in order for a golf swing to occur. Installing a program on a computer, there are many different behaviors: inserting the disk or downloading the program, clicking, agreeing to all the EULAs, the license agreements, allocating where it's installed, just all these different behaviors combining into this one larger scale behavior. So you can think of it kind of as an assembly line. All these different parts, pieces, behaviors combining to form this end product of this ideal behavior. These combinations of these different micro behaviors, they're known as behavioral chains, but it's important for us to understand that what's happening within a behavioral chain is actually a stimulus response chain. So what does that mean? Well, each behavior is in itself some kind of discriminative stimulus that should lead to an increased likelihood of the next behavior occurring. So if installing a program is my kind of large-scale macro behavior, one micro behavior would be downloading the program. If I download the program, that's a discriminative stimulus that's going to make me installing the program more likely. And clicking to install is going to make me agree to the terms more likely. It's going to make me allocate disk space more likely, so on and so forth. So really what's happening is you have an initial stimulus, and it's important that the first kind of micro behavior should be enacted by a discriminative stimulus in the environment. So if we want to focus on, say, like brushing teeth, could be a macro behavior. Well, you're only going to brush your teeth if, say, you have dirty teeth, or maybe if you have a bad taste in your mouth. You're only going to decide to clean your room if your room is dirty. So once that discriminative stimulus presents itself in the environment, then the first behavior of the chain occurs, and that behavior leads to the next behavior, which leads to the next behavior, etc., etc. This chain, importantly, only continues or only occurs more frequently if that last behavior, that final behavior that should lead to the completion of the macro behavior, only if that behavior is reinforced. So it's important that reinforcement does occur at the very end of the chain. Otherwise, again, we're not going to want to perform that behavior anymore or any less. So introducing these more complicated behaviors or behavioral chains requires a lot of effort. And really, before you get started in introducing this, you want to make sure you know exactly what's happening with the behavioral chain, what the steps are, what the ideal ways of maybe parsing out the behavior is, especially for the specific individual that you want to use the intervention on. And so that's why we really want to use task analysis similar to behavioral analysis or behavioral assessment that we talked about earlier to really analyze this behavioral chain. We can do this in many ways. We can observe ourselves or the other person directly. If it's a complicated task that maybe it's difficult to observe, we can ask the person directly what's going on, or we can perform the task ourselves to really understand exactly what the pieces are to be able to help another person learn how to perform this behavior, and especially the micro behaviors associated with this behavior. It is possible to revise these. It's not the case where you perform a task analysis and then you're kind of stuck with the behavioral chain and the specific behaviors and discriminative stimuli that you've chosen. Sometimes if people are getting the hang of a certain subset of behaviors, you can lump those into one during the training. In other situations, maybe a person's having special amount of difficulty with one specific behavior, you can break that down into further different portions of behavior. So maybe you initially had a micro behavior of just simply scrub your teeth. Well, maybe you need to focus on the specific techniques, which direction to brush, where you need to brush, again, breaking behaviors down further if people are having trouble picking up on that behavior. Again, it's all in the service of helping the specific individual learn how to perform this behavior, specifically this behavioral chain. So the way we actually implement this strategy is basically through prompting and fading strategies to each individual micro behavior or each individual component in this chain. So let's use the example of teaching a child how to feed themselves when we go through some of these different procedures. So one procedure would be backwards chaining. That would be teaching the kind of last behavior first. That would be the first behavior that the target is going to learn, and then you kind of work backwards from there. So in doing so, you're teaching the last behavior and you're reinforcing that last behavior every time. And as different behaviors are added, each discriminative stimulus that occurs after one of the micro behaviors acts as kind of a conditioned reinforcer, allowing the individual to move on to the next behavior. So using the child feeding themselves example, we would start with the behavior of the child actually eating the food. That would be, say, a parent actually scooping up food onto a spoon and then putting it in the child's mouth and them eating it. So that's kind of the end goal. And then we would work backwards from there. If we want the child to be able to feed themselves, maybe we grab the spoon, put the food on the spoon, and then put it in the child's hand, and then the child actually moves the spoon to their mouth. That would be adding a new behavior before that final behavior of actually eating the food. Then once the child gets a handle of that, we would, instead of scooping the food onto the spoon as an adult, we would allow the child to do that. So you can see how working backwards can be helpful for certain behaviors. It's especially helpful for this situation because you want the child to get food no matter what. You want to feed the child. This way, using backwards chaining, you're definitely positive that the child is going to get food, but you're just not quite sure how many of the behaviors the child is actually going to perform. So backwards chaining has its strengths. We can also use forward chaining. That would be kind of going in chronological order, teaching that initial behavior, that first micro behavior, and then moving forward, adding each behavior one by one. So rather than the reinforcement always following that final behavior, it follows the basically last part of the behavior wherever the target is at that point in the chain. Focusing on the eating example, rather than starting with sticking food in the child's mouth, you would start with that first behavior that you want the child to do, which would be maybe holding the spoon in their hand. And then once they're able to do that effectively, you would encourage them to scoop the food. And then after that, you would encourage them to bring the food to their mouth and then finally eat and chew on the food. So again, maybe not the best idea to use forward chaining for this example because depending on how quickly the child's able to pick up on all these behaviors, they're not going to get a whole lot to eat. But you could see how it could be effective for some other behaviors, maybe learning a golf swing. One final procedure that's sometimes used is known as total task presentation. That's when the behavior is taught as a single unit, as a kind of macro behavior. But the teacher themselves is giving praise after each separate component or reinforcing each separate component of that behavior. So a father might reinforce grabbing the spoon, might reinforce scooping up food, might reinforce moving it to their mouth, but it's framed as one behavior, as eating food. Because each specific component of the behavior is being reinforced, you can use what's known as graduated guidance. Say the child is especially having difficulty scooping up food, the parent can focus in on that specific component of the behavioral chain and really help either shadow behavior or model it, give physical guidance. But because, yes, we're framing this as eating food, but because we are actually breaking things up into components, we can give special attention or special help to certain parts of the chain rather than having to give guidance to the whole thing. There are some other tools that we can use as part of training. We can use written task analysis. That would be basically giving written instructions to someone, teaching them how to perform the behavior, how to perform each specific step of a behavior. We see this a lot with instructions on basically how to build things that we need to actually put together ourselves. Also, sometimes in these instructions you might see picture prompts. IKEA is known for a lot of these and helping people to build their products. Rather than written descriptions, it's basically visual depictions of the behaviors that you need to perform to actually accomplish this macro behavior or goal of, say, for example, building a table. We can see video modeling, so rather than static pictures, we can actually see moving pictures, watching people actually performing these behaviors and using that as a guide to be able to focus on each specific component of the behavioral chain. So for example, it's a lot easier to learn how to swing a golf club if you can watch someone do it yourself, or learn how to serve a tennis ball, for example. And sometimes we can use self-instructions. These would be just kind of self-generated prompts, sometimes verbal prompts, sometimes reciting information in your head to make sure that you're able to perform the behavioral chain in the appropriate order and to perform the appropriate behaviors when need be. So when actually trying to use this technique, trying to apply chaining to learn a complex behavior, again, just like some of the other techniques we've used, there are definite considerations you need to make. You want to use task analysis to figure out what each component of the chain is. You also want to get a baseline assessment of the learner's ability. There are kind of two methods that you can use, and it's important to distinguish between these two methods before actually choosing what specific chaining method and implementing the procedure. If you want to assess how effective a chain is, you can use a single opportunity method that would be presenting that initial discriminative stimulus and seeing if a person is able to go through all the micro behaviors or components of that behavioral chain. So if we want to use the golf ball example, we would put a golf ball in front of a person and see if they could perform all those specific muscle movements to actually swing a club and hit a golf ball. We would only present that one stimulus. Alternatively, we could use a multiple opportunity method. That would be presenting each discriminative stimulus that should be a part of that behavioral chain to see if the individual subsequently performs the behavior that should follow that discriminative stimulus. So if we think about the toothbrushing example, we might give a person a toothbrush and see if they follow the chain, or see if they perform the next behavior that should be performed, which could be getting the toothbrush wet. We might then jump ahead in the chain and present a different discriminative stimulus, which would be a toothbrush that already has toothpaste on it, and then see if the person is able to, again, perform the next appropriate behavior and follow through with the chain. So that's all I have for chaining. Again, great for introducing new and complex behaviors to someone's repertoire. But that's all I have today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you on the next video.